What if I told you there's an island on this planet where an entire civilization built hundreds of massive stone faces and then mysteriously collapsed, leaving behind nothing but silence, questions, and warnings? No enemies, no invasions, just people who slowly destroyed the very world they depended on. Imagine standing there, alone, surrounded by giant statues watching you, as if they know something you don't. What really happened on this island? Was it human ambition? Human error? Or something far more unsettling? Stay with me, because this is not just a story about the past. It's a story about us. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. There are places in this world that seem to exist outside the rhythm of time. Places where history does not simply pass, but lingers, breathes, and watches, breathes, and watches. This is the story of such a place. An island, remote and isolated, surrounded not just by water, but by mystery, by silence, by a past so unusual that it feels almost unreal, A place where the boundaries between human civilization and untouched nature blur into something deeply unsettling and strangely beautiful. This is the story of one of the strangest islands in human history. Far out in the vast blue emptiness of the Pacific Ocean lies an island that, for centuries, defied explanation. When early explorers first arrived, they expected the familiar trees, wildlife, signs of thriving life. Instead, they found something haunting: giant stone figures, dozens then hundreds, standing silently across the land, their faces carved with an expression that seemed neither welcoming nor hostile. Only knowing these statues did not simply decorate the island, they dominated it, they watched over it, and perhaps in a way, they remembered it. Who built them? Why were they built? And how did a remote island, cut off from the rest of the world, create something so monumental? The island we now call Easter Island, known to its people as Rapa Nui, was settled by Polynesian voyagers centuries ago. These were people of extraordinary courage. They crossed vast oceans guided only by stars, wind, and instinct. They arrived on a land both promising and unforgiving. At first, the island flourished. The forests were thick. The soil was fertile. The people built communities, developed culture, and created a belief system deeply tied to their ancestors. And it was this belief, this reverence for those who came before, that gave rise to the great statues, the Moai. Each one represented an ancestor, a guardian, a symbol of power and protection. To carve and transport these massive figures, some weighing dozens of tons, required ingenuity, coordination, and an unshakable sense of purpose. But greatness often carries a cost. Over time, the island began to change. The forests, once vast and life-giving, began to disappear. Trees were cut to move the statues, to build canoes, to sustain daily life. But on an island, resources are not infinite. And when the trees were gone, they were gone forever. Without forests, the soil eroded. Crops failed. Without wood, canoes could no longer be built. Fishing declined. Isolation deepened. What had once been a thriving society began to fracture. Conflict emerged. Rival clans fought for control. The same statues that once symbolized unity and reverence became part of competition. Who could build the largest, the most impressive, the most powerful? And in time, even those great stone guardians were toppled. The island that had once reached extraordinary heights now faced collapse. And yet the story does not end there, because even in the face of environmental collapse, social unrest, and near total isolation, the people of Rapa Nui endured. They adapted. They created new systems of survival, new traditions, new ways of understanding their world. They did not vanish into history. They carried it forward, reshaped it, and lived it. And that may be the most remarkable part of all. The strangest island in history is not strange because of its statues alone. It is strange because it reflects something deeply human. It tells a story of ambition, the desire to create something lasting, something meaningful. It tells a story of consequence, how even the greatest achievements can come at a cost. And it tells a story of resilience, the quiet, stubborn will to survive, even when everything seems lost. Today, those stone figures still stand, weathered by time, scarred by history, yet unbroken. They gaze out across the land and sea as they have for centuries, silent witnesses to the rise and fall of a civilization and to the enduring strength of the human spirit. And perhaps, if we listen closely, they are not silent at all. Perhaps they are telling us something about balance, about respect, about the fragile line between greatness and destruction. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. Ambition begins as something noble, almost sacred. It rises from the deepest part of the human spirit, the desire to build, to create, to leave behind something that proves we were here, that we mattered. On a remote island in the vast Pacific, this ambition took shape in stone. The people who settled there were not reckless dreamers. They were skilled navigators, disciplined builders, and deeply spiritual individuals who believed that their ancestors held power over the living world. Their ambition was not rooted in greed, but in reverence. They carved towering figures from volcanic rock, each one representing a lineage, a memory, a connection to those who had come before. These statues were not merely art. They were identity made visible, belief made permanent. To raise such monuments required more than vision. It demanded organization, labor, and resources on a scale that the island had never seen before. Trees were cut to create tools, to build sleds, to transport the massive stone figures across uneven ground. Forests that had once stretched across the landscape began to thin. At first, the changes may have seemed small, almost unnoticeable. A few missing groves here, a slightly longer journey to gather wood there. Progress has a way of disguising its cost, especially when that cost is gradual. The people continued to build, to compete, to outdo one another in devotion and display. Each new statue stood taller, more imposing than the last, as if the island itself were being reshaped by human will. Ambition, however, rarely recognizes limits unless it is forced to confront them. On an island, limits are absolute. There are no distant forests to harvest, no neighboring lands to supply what has been exhausted. Everything that sustains life exists within a fragile, closed system. As the trees disappeared, the consequences began to ripple outward. Without roots to hold the soil in place, the earth itself started to erode. Crops became harder to grow, yields less reliable. The balance that had once supported a thriving community began to shift, almost imperceptibly at first, then with growing urgency. Wood, once abundant, became scarce. Without it, canoes could not be built or repaired. Fishing, which had supplemented the island's food supply, declined sharply. The ocean, once a source of sustenance and connection, became distant and unreachable. The people were left with fewer options, fewer resources, and increasing pressure to survive. Yet, even in the face of these challenges, the drive to build, to prove, to honor did not immediately fade. Ambition does not surrender easily, especially when it is tied to identity and belief. There is a moment in every society when ambition must confront reality. It is rarely a single event, rarely a clear turning point. Instead, it unfolds over years, even generations, as the consequences of past decisions accumulate. On this island, that moment came as scarcity deepened. Food became more difficult to secure. Competition intensified. The unity that had once driven collective achievement began to fracture under the weight of necessity. Clans that had once cooperated in building monuments now turned inward, prioritizing their own survival. Ambition, when unbalanced, begins to shift in character. What once inspired creation can begin to fuel division. The same desire to excel, to be greater, to leave a mark, can transform into rivalry, into conflict. To leave a mark can transform into rivalry, into conflict. The statues, once symbols of shared reverence, became markers of competition. Who could build the largest? Who could demonstrate the greatest power? In a world of diminishing resources, these questions took on new meaning. They were no longer about honoring the past. They were about asserting dominance in an uncertain present. As the environment continued to degrade, the social fabric of the island weakened. Trust eroded alongside the soil. Cooperation gave way to suspicion. The systems that had once supported large-scale construction and cultural expression could no longer be sustained. The very achievements that had defined the island's greatness became part of its burden. Resources had been consumed in the pursuit of monuments that could not feed the hungry or restore the land. The fall of the statues themselves marked a profound transformation. These towering figures, once raised with care and ceremony, were toppled, whether through conflict, disillusionment, or necessity. Their decline symbolized more than physical destruction. It represented a shift in values, a recognition, perhaps too late, that the path taken had led to imbalance. The guardians of the past could no longer protect a future that had been compromised. Yet the story of ambition without balance is not simply one of failure. It is a reflection of a universal human tendency. The drive to achieve, to create, to push beyond limits is one of humanity's greatest strengths. It has led to extraordinary advancements, to art, to innovation, to exploration. But when that drive is not tempered by awareness, by restraint, by an understanding of consequences, it can become destructive. On a small island, the effects are immediate and undeniable. In a larger world, they may take longer to reveal themselves, but they are no less real. The people of this island did not set out to destroy their environment or undermine their society. They acted within the framework of their beliefs, their needs, and their aspirations. Each decision, taken alone, may have seemed reasonable, even necessary. It is only in hindsight that the pattern becomes clear. The gradual movement from balance to excess, from sustainability to depletion. This is the quiet danger of unchecked ambition. It does not announce itself as a threat. It presents itself as progress, as devotion, as success. To understand this story is to recognize the delicate relationship between human desire and the world that sustains it. Ambition must be guided, not abandoned. It must be informed by an awareness of limits, by a respect for the systems that support life. Without that balance, even the most impressive achievements can carry the seeds of their own undoing. Isolation has a way of reshaping reality. It compresses the world, narrows perspective, and intensifies every decision, every mistake, every success. On a remote island surrounded by thousands of miles of open ocean, isolation was not simply a condition, it was a defining force. It dictated what was possible, what was sustainable, and ultimately, what would endure. For the people who lived there, The horizon was not a gateway to opportunity, but a boundary, a silent reminder that there was no easy escape from the consequences of their choices. In more connected societies, errors can be absorbed, softened by external support. Trade routes bring resources when local supplies falter. Neighboring communities offer alternatives, ideas, and relief. But in isolation, there are no such buffers. Every resource must be drawn from the land itself. Every problem must be solved within the limits of what is available. The margin for error is thin, and the cost of miscalculation is high. This creates a unique kind of pressure, one that amplifies both ingenuity and vulnerability. The island's early inhabitants were not unaware of their isolation. They had crossed vast oceans to reach this place, guided by knowledge passed down through generations. They understood the sea, the stars, the delicate balance required to survive in a remote environment. For a time, that understanding was enough. They adapted to the land, cultivated crops, and built a society that reflected both their resourcefulness and their beliefs. Isolation, in those early years, may have even felt like protection, a distance from conflict, from competition, from the uncertainties of a wider world. But isolation is not static. It evolves as conditions change. What begins as protection can become confinement. As the island's resources were gradually depleted, the absence of external connections became more significant. There were no new materials arriving, no fresh knowledge entering the system, no alternative lands to explore or settle. The people were left with what they had, and what they had was diminishing. In such an environment, every decision carries greater weight. There is no room for sustained imbalance, no safety net to catch a falling system. As forests disappeared and resources grew scarce, the effects of isolation became more pronounced. The inability to build or repair canoes meant that fishing declined, cutting off a vital source of food. The ocean, once a pathway, became a barrier. The people were effectively sealed within the limits of their island, their options narrowing with each passing generation. This physical isolation was mirrored by a kind of intellectual and cultural isolation. Without contact with other societies, there were fewer opportunities to exchange ideas, to learn alternative methods, to adapt based on the experiences of others. In such conditions, traditions can become both a strength and a constraint. They provide continuity, a sense of identity, a framework for understanding the world. But they can also resist change, especially when change is urgently needed. The practices that once supported growth and stability may no longer be suited to new realities. Yet in isolation without external perspectives to challenge or refine those practices, adaptation can be slow. The weight of tradition can hold a society in place, even as the ground beneath it shifts. Isolation also magnifies internal dynamics. In a small, closed system, relationships are intensified. Cooperation is essential, but so is competition. When resources are abundant, these forces can coexist, balanced by shared prosperity. But when scarcity takes hold, the balance shifts. Competition becomes sharper, more urgent. Conflicts that might have been minor in a larger, more connected world can escalate quickly when there is now reals to go, no alternative communities to join, no external authorities to mediate. The island's social structure, once capable of organizing large-scale projects and maintaining cohesion, began to strain under these pressures. Clans and groups that had once collaborated in building monuments and sustaining the community turned inward. Loyalty to one's immediate group became more critical than broader unity. In isolation, identity can become more rigid, more defined by boundaries than by connections. The absence of external interaction, reinforces internal divisions, making it harder to maintain a shared sense of purpose. Psychologically, isolation shapes how people perceive their circumstances. When there is no outside reference point, it becomes more difficult to recognize the extent of change or decline. Each generation inherits a world that feels normal to them, even if it is markedly different from what came before. The gradual loss of forests, the decline in resources, the shift in social structures, these changes may not have been fully understood in their broader context. Without comparison, without knowledge of alternative possibilities, it is harder to see the trajectory of a society, harder to anticipate where it is heading. This does not mean that the people were passive or unaware. They adapted in ways that allowed them to survive under increasingly difficult conditions. They developed new methods of agriculture, new social practices, new ways of organizing their lives. But adaptation within isolation has limits. It is constrained by what is known, by what is available, by what can be imagined without external influence. The range of possible solutions is narrower, and the consequences of choosing the wrong path are more immediate. Isolation also removes the possibility of retreat. In many parts of the world, when conditions become untenable, people move. They seek new lands, new opportunities, new beginnings. On this island, such movement was no longer possible. The loss of canoes and the vastness of the surrounding ocean made departure an almost unthinkable option. The people were bound to their environment in a way that few societies experience. This binding intensified the impact of every environmental and social change. There was no elsewhere, only here. The interplay between isolation and consequence creates a powerful dynamic. Actions that might seem manageable in a connected world become far more significant when there is no external support. The depletion of a resource is not a temporary setback, but a permanent loss. A failed strategy is not easily replaced by a better one drawn from elsewhere. Every choice reverberates through the system, its effects felt more deeply and more immediately. In this way, isolation acts as a magnifier. It does not create human tendencies. Ambition, competition, innovation, but it intensifies their outcomes. It accelerates the feedback loop between action and consequence. It reveals with stark clarity the strengths and weaknesses of a society. The island becomes a kind of living experiment, a place where the dynamics of human behavior are played out within a closed system, where the results cannot be deferred or displaced. To look at such a place is to see, in concentrated form, the broader patterns that shape human history. The difference lies in scale and speed. What unfolds over centuries or millennia in larger, interconnected worlds can occur more rapidly and more visibly in isolation. The lessons are the same, but they are harder to ignore, more difficult to dismiss. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. Resilience is often misunderstood. It is not loud, not triumphant, no, to always visible in grand gestures or dramatic victories. More often, it exists in quiet persistence, in the steady continuation of life under conditions that seem to offer little hope. On a remote island shaped by ambition, strained by isolation, and tested by collapse, resilience did not emerge as a single moment of recovery, but as a long, uneven process of adaptation. It was not about restoring what had been lost, because much of that could never be reclaimed. It was about finding ways to live within new limits, to endure in a world that had fundamentally changed. When the forests were gone, they did not return. The The towering trees that had once provided material, shelter, and ecological balance were no longer part of the landscape. The people could not simply rebuild what had existed before. Resilience, in this context, required a shift in thinking, a movement away from reliance on what had been abundant toward a careful management of what remained. This meant reimagining agriculture, developing techniques that could preserve soil and maximize limited resources. It meant learning to work with a harsher environment, one that no longer offered the same level of support. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it easy. Generations grew up in a world defined by scarcity, where survival depended on knowledge that had to be rediscovered, refined, and passed on. The old ways, once effective, were no longer sufficient, yet the cultural memory of those ways did not disappear entirely. It lingered, reshaped, and reinterpreted to fit new realities. Resilience often draws from the past, even as it moves beyond it, taking fragments of what once worked and adapting them to what is now possible. Social structures also evolved under pressure. The systems that had supported large-scale construction and hierarchical organization were no longer sustainable in the same form. As resources became more limited, the focus shifted towards smaller, more localized forms of cooperation. Communities adapted by strengthening internal bonds, by creating networks of support that could function within the constraints of their environment. Authority and leadership may have changed, becoming more responsive to immediate needs rather than long-term displays of power. Conflict did not vanish, but resilience required ways to manage it, to prevent it from completely fracturing the Majtama. In a closed system, prolonged instability threatens everyone. Over time, practices and norms likely developed to reduce the intensity of conflict, to channel competition into forms that were less destructive. These changes were not the result of a single decision, but of gradual adjustments shaped by experience and necessity. Culturally, resilience can be seen in the ability to maintain identity even as circumstances shift. The people of the island did not abandon their sense of who they were. Their beliefs, their stories, their connection to their ancestors continued, though often in altered forms. The great statues, once central to their expression of identity, were no longer being built or maintained in the same way. Yet the meaning behind them, the reverence for lineage, the recognition of those who came before, persisted. It found new expressions, new rituals, new ways of being remembered. One of the most striking aspects of resilience is its capacity to transform loss into knowledge. Each challenge, each failure, becomes part of a collective understanding of what works and what does not. On the island, this knowledge would have been critical. Techniques for conserving soil, for managing limited water, for organizing labor efficiently, these were not abstract ideas, but essential tools for survival. They were learned through experience, often through hardship, and then embedded into the fabric of daily life. Resilience also requires a certain acceptance of limits. This does not mean passivity or resignation, but a clear recognition of what cannot be changed. The island's isolation, its finite resources, its altered environment, these were realities that had to be faced directly. Efforts to live as if those limits did not exist would only lead to further strain. Instead, resilience involved aligning behavior with reality, making choices that were sustainable within the constraints of the environment. This alignment often demands restraint, a willingness to forego immediate gain for long-term stability. It asks individuals and communities to think beyond the present moment, to consider the impact of their actions on future generations. On an island where the consequences of overuse had already been felt, this kind of thinking would have been essential. It is not easy to adopt, particularly in the face of scarcity, but it is a cornerstone of enduring resilience. There is also a psychological dimension to resilience that is less visible but equally important. To continue in the face of loss requires a certain strength of spirit, a capacity to find meaning even when circumstances are difficult. This meaning may come from community, from tradition, from a sense of responsibility to others. It may come from the simple act of survival itself, from the determination to persist despite adversity. On the island, where external escape was not an option, this internal resilience would have been a critical resource. Resilience does not erase the past, nor does it undo the consequences of earlier actions. The scars remain both in the environment and in the collective memory, but it allows a Majustema to move forward, to build a life that is viable within new conditions. It is a process of continuous adjustment, of learning and relearning, of dying, kneeing balance in a world that has been altered. The story of resilience on this island is not one of returning to a former state of prosperity or grandeur. It is a story of survival through change, of maintaining continuity in the face of disruption. It shows that even when systems collapse, when environments are transformed, when options are limited, there remains a capacity to adapt. This capacity is not infinite, and it is not guaranteed to succeed in every circumstance, but it is a defining feature of human societies, a thread that runs through history, connecting moments of crisis to the possibility of endurance. In the quiet routines of daily life, planting, harvesting, sharing, teaching, the work of resilience continues. It is carried forward not by a single generation, but by many, each contributing to a body of knowledge and practice that sustains the whole. It is shaped by necessity, but also by choice, by the decisions people make about how to live, how to relate to one another, how to use what they have. In this way, resilience becomes more than a response to hardship. It becomes a way of being, a framework for navigating a world where certainty is rare and change is constant. It reflects an understanding that survival is not simply about enduring the present, but about preparing for the future, even when that future is uncertain, even when the path forward is unclear. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.